ഓക്കെ, ഞാൻ തുടങ്ങുന്നു. ഓക്കെ. Okay, thank you for having me. This is a rather strange experience speaking to a blank screen since I can neither see nor hear anybody at the other end. Now it's become visible. Great. Okay, now I can hear. Raji, I can see you now. കേൾക്കാം, കാണാം, എല്ലാം ചെയ്യാം പ്രത്യക്ഷമായി. ഓക്കെ, തുടങ്ങിക്കാം. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you, and I hope to speak for around 40 to 45 minutes. The topic that's been given to me is to speak on modernism and postmodernism, and in many senses this is something that is something that I've been speaking on for the last 20 years, so it's kind of interesting that I should be having to speak on it 20 years down the line as well. But before I begin, just to tell you briefly about the kind of work that I have been doing over the past decade or more. As some of you may have been reading my work, I work on 4 major areas. The first is on oceanic history, so trying to move beyond what I see as largely Hindu terrestrial histories centered on land, Janmam, Patam, Kanam, etc., and on the notions of king, notions of temple, Kshetram, Brahmadeyam, those kinds of issues, to move away from that towards a history that engages with the ocean, engaging with histories of Muslims, Christians, the fisher people who are the marginal community. The second set of issues, again, which I've been working with for quite a long time, are on issues of caste and modernity, and some of which I shall be speaking about in the course of this talk today. And the idea of colonial modernity, that the modernity that we experience in India in the 19th and early 20th centuries is inflected through colonialism, and that it has, in many senses, works through a set of hierarchies and a set of visions that have been curtailed by the presence of colonialism in India. So, for example, I've looked at the different worlds of 2 novels written almost simultaneously, the novel Saraswati Vijayam written by Potheri Kunyambu and Indulekha written by Chandu Menon, and how they show 2 very different worlds, as it were, even though they are written by contemporaries. The third thing, which is where my work has been moving towards of late, is to think about the very important and pressing and urgent problem of why is it that in places like India, we continue to work with a theory that comes from elsewhere. So whether we are speaking about Pathanamthitta or Wayanad, we leap to Derrida, Foucault, Levinas, and so on, instead of working with categories of thought that come from our spaces, our traditions of thought, and so on. Finally, I think my most recent work tries to address some of the lacunae in my earlier work. So I'm currently working on 2 issues. One is on Waqar Muhammad Maulvi and his journal Deepika, and the issue of Islamic modernism and Indian Ocean Islam, the new work that's being done by a whole lot of very important young Malayali scholars, including Muhammad Kuria, Yasser Arafat, Ihsan Ehtesham, and others, and to try and understand the different visions of the globe and different visions of modernity. So we're not thinking with the conventional notions of modernity which come to us largely from texts written by upper caste Hindus. And finally, the work that I'm looking at, which is a much longer term work, the work on Waqar Muhammad Maulvi is a paper. A book-length work that I'm really thinking about right now is to work on the idea of satire in Malayalam. So I'm looking at the works of E.V. Krishnapilla, Sanjayan, and others, and probably trying to do a long durée history that extends into the work of the Ottandullal and so on, Kunjan Nambiar, and asking why is it that satire becomes a dominant mood in Malayalam literature? What role does satire play? Is it a kind of disaffection with modernity? Is it a kind of disaffection with the cosmopolitanism that we see as characterizing Malayali society? So those preliminary remarks apart, what I want to do really is to try and think with why are we obsessed, or why are we thinking with this question of modernism and postmodernism when there are probably other theoretical configurations, other theoretical paradigms that we really could be thinking with. So what I put, the picture that I put before you, or the picture that you're probably seeing before you, is still from a film. And I thought I would begin with the still because I'm searching for a metaphor to think about our condition. Right? Our condition being that regardless of the fact that we live in Kerala or live in India, we refuse in many senses or lack the courage to think with the theoretical vocabulary that arises from our spaces. In many senses, we continue to be uh, trapped in what Walter Mignolo calls relations of coloniality, so that we can make arguments about our spaces only through a theory that comes from elsewhere. So what you see before you is a still from the Taiwanese filmmaker Tsai Ming Liang's 2001 film with a very resonant title. The title of the film is What Time Is It There? And the story of the film in brief is this. There is a watch seller in Taipei, the important city in Taiwan, and he sells watches for a living. And one day he meets a mysterious young woman who comes up to him and wants to buy a watch from him, and she insists on buying the watch from his wrist rather than buying the various watches he has on display. He resists initially, but then sells her the watch, and then she leaves. She leaves Taiwan and she goes off to France. So, in his moment of longing and love, and in many senses, a melancholy about her departure, he sets all the watches in his house to Parisian time, the time that she is experiencing, and he spends all his time in a cinema hall watching French films, including Francois Truffaut's 400 coups or 400 blows. Now, in many senses, this captures our condition because very often when we sit down to write, when we sit down to think, we are always concerned with the question of what time is it there, not what time is it that we inhabit. And so it is this particular problem that I think condenses for the predicament that we are all in at present. So, what does it mean for us to live in a time that is not determined by us? Very often, our understanding of the time that we live in is governed by a kind of longing, a longing to be elsewhere, a longing to be in another time. Why are we not modern enough? Why are we not like the Europe or the United States? Why do we not have capitalism? And so on. Multiple questions. These are the kinds of questions that Dipesh Chakravarti talked about in Provincializing Europe, where we think about our histories in terms of an absence, a lack, that somehow there is something that we lack which is available elsewhere. And modernity becomes, for many of us, the obscure object of our desire. This is something that we deeply desire, but which we feel we do not possess, we do not inhabit, and so on. And the earlier notions that colonialism gave us of a civilizational hierarchy, which put Europe at the very top and Africa right at the bottom, with India somewhere in between, those civilizational hierarchies have now been replaced in the post-colonial era, but we still have that linear time of progress, right? Where there is this race that we're all taking part in, but we are not there as yet. We're somehow lagging behind. And this question of a temporal lag, the question of an absence, is something that governs our theoretical thinking as well. And this carries the residue of imperialism and of colonialism, which leads us to engage with the Latin American thinkers like Mignolo, Enrique Dussel, who died recently, this question of coloniality that conditions the existence of those of us who live in the global south. Dipesh Chakravarti, in Provincializing Europe, put it beautifully in a phrase that is unmatched, where he said, we are condemned to be in the waiting room of history. We are constantly waiting in order to participate, and we are unable to do this. We don't know how. The other problem that arises from this is what Tagore, in his essay, in his speeches on nationalism in the early 20th century, as he traveled to the US and Japan, very critical of nationalism. He didn't win any friends during the course of this tour. He said, we cannot continue to write our histories with histories that come from elsewhere. And this is an important point that we still haven't begun to reckon with. And very often when we write our histories, it is governed by what Sudipta Kaviraj has called Euronormality, right? That Europe is the normal that we aspire to. We think the way our history should proceed is to become more and more and more like the history that is happening elsewhere. We are less concerned with the rhythms of our own history, more concerned with the trajectories of our history. That given time, we need to or should become like that elsewhere that we long for. Euronormality, as he calls it. And very often, as Sudipta Kaviraj puts it, there is a very neat trajectory. So we have something like, to put it very simply, the growth of individualism, the growth of secularism, the growth of industrialization, the growth of democracy, and so on. This is the linear trajectory that Europe went through. But in India, as we know, democracy came to us before industrialization. We're still struggling with questions of secularism and individualism. So, what does it mean to think and write the history of India as if we were writing the history of Europe? Right? And this is the question that Sudipta Kaviraj poses before us. And this different sequentiality, right? It's a different set of sequences that happen in our spaces. But we think about our space in terms of an ideal sequence, right? And this is the question that hangs over this issue of thinking about modernism and postmodernism. Why do we think with the concepts and categories of modernism and postmodernism in our spaces? What are the theoretical categories that we could actually think with? So modernity and the idea of progress, right? So very often when we connect modernity with the idea of progress, we know there have been extensive critiques of this. This is just a kind of quickly going through some of the steps before I go on to the main argument. And the idea of progress, which really we saw culminated in colonialism, culminated in the world wars, culminated in the Holocaust, right? In the middle of the 20th century. So modernity was a very flawed enterprise, and very often European renderings of modernity are brush these facts under the carpet. Modernity is presented as something desirable, whereas how modernity was experienced in large parts of the world, including such as ours in the global south, was a scene of devastation, was a scene of loss, was a scene of epistemological control, and so on and so forth. So this question of postmodernism arose really in post-1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Union and what Lyotard called the death of the grand narrative, right? That the whole notion of progress and these big narratives that wrote history in terms of progress had come to an end. But at the same time, there was a kind of triumphalism that what had happened was that dialectic between socialism and democracy had come to an end, democracy had triumphed. But as we know, Europe is in pretty much a big mess right now with questions of racism, with questions of anti-immigration policies, and so on and so forth. And the very fact that Europe is an entity struggling to maintain itself in the face of multiple strains pulling in different directions, Brexit being one example of that. So if we think about all of this, right, if we think about modernism, we think about postmodernism, all of these are flawed enterprises which originate in certain kinds of illusions or forgettings that happen within Europe, which we have taken on board wholesale. And that's the thing that we need to question. So even if we think about post-colonial theory, right, which is probably the way in which a large number of theorists from the global south attempted to write back, as it were, to Europe, post-colonial theory was again flawed by one major fact, which is that it tried to locate itself within histories of European philosophy. So if you think about the major post-colonial theorists, none of them, in Indians, for example, think about subaltern studies, Dipesh Chakravarti, none of them rooted themselves or sought to engage with traditions of critical thinking from within India, right? Dipesh Chakravarti is hugely influenced by Heidegger. Ranajit Guha is hugely influenced by Hegel. Subaltern studies itself was a mixture of, as somebody put it, German idealism, British Marxism, and French post-structuralism, right? So in that sense, our major critical enterprise from South Asia has been something that has not taken South Asia and its thought into account. And this is a problem that we need to think with. There was no engagement with indigenous traditions of intellection. This is what the African writer, Kenyan writer and intellectual Ngugi wa Thiong'o called Europhone theory, that we think with Southern facts, Northern theory. In a different way, Gopal Guru has made a similar argument where he says Shudra fact, Brahmin theory, right? And so we could think about the multiple ramifications of this, that we continue to think with Europe regardless of what we are thinking about, right, in India. And this is a problem that we need to confront. The most precise formulation of this problem was posed by one of our great literary critics, Ganesh Devi, in his book written in the 90s, which is called After Amnesia. This is a wonderful title that captures a condition, the condition of the modern intellectual in India, where he argued that when he began his PhD in literature, he was told to read the usual stuff, F.R. Lewis and American critics and English critics and so on. And he asked, look, we've been around for 1,000 years. There's a huge tradition of classical Indian literary criticism. Why is this not brought to bear on our study? Why is it that we leave this aside? And this is what he called after amnesia, that colonialism had instituted a certain kind of amnesia with regard to our rich intellectual resources. And what we preferred instead to do was to hitchhike on European narratives, right? We stand there with our thumbs out hoping to get a ride on this European narrative. And rather, if you look at the current political economy of publication and so on, and those of you who have tried to publish in journals abroad, that it's less about hitchhiking and more about being illegal immigrants on this narrative, because you're constantly asked for your papers, right? Metaphorically, that when you wish to publish in an American journal or a European journal, you're asked to cite the requisite literature that comes from there, regardless of what it is that you're working on. You could be working on democratic decentralization in Paravur or in Perinalmanna, but when it comes to the citation of the literature, you need to cite the European literature on development, modernity, etc., etc. So in that sense, there is this question of being less hitchhikers and more like illegal immigrants. So what would it mean? So for example, if you're writing something on Malayalam literature, let's say, and you want to publish in a journal, so what would it mean if we wanted to draw upon Kutty Krishna Marar, for example, or N. Krishnapilla, with his brilliant book, Pradipatram Bhashana Vedam, which is on C.V. Ramapilla, or P.K. Balakrishnan, who's written on the novel? What if we were to use these as our modes of literary criticism, our sources of literary criticism? Very often, what would the likely outcome is that people would say, well, look, you need to be citing European and American literary critics, regardless of what you're writing on. So this is, again, takes us back to this question of why our obsession with modernism and postmodernism, rather than trying to understand where we come from and the range of thinking in the spaces that we come from. So the question is, what happens when we think from categories drawn from our spaces, our histories, and our traditions of thinking? When I say our, I'm putting it in quotation marks, because obviously there is a huge differentiation of gender, caste, class, ethnicity, and so on within India. But our, I mean, are largely South Asian traditions of thinking. Why do we lack the courage, the temerity, the changutam, as it were? Why do we lack that? When we theorize, why do we jump to European modes of thinking rather than the huge landscape of thought that is available, which Ganesh Devi hinted at or worked with? So if we look away from the glare of subaltern studies and other successes in the global space, what if we look at alternate and parallel theorizing based on a subaltern theorizing? And this is something that has constantly been present. Not only in terms of, subaltern theorizing, I'm taking up as an example, but as I said, when I study Waka Muhammad Maulavi or when I study, the works of Balakrishna, I'm immediately aware of the rich resources of critical thinking that are available, which I could deploy in order to understand the world, literature, imagination, and so on and so forth. So if we get back to this question of writing our histories with histories that come from elsewhere, that which Tagore warned us against, let's think about the casual use, for example. This is something that's almost kind of been normalized in the way we study Kerala. So the use of the word Renaissance, for example, Navothanam. and creating a parallel history of Europe and India. So when we ask, was there a Renaissance in Malayalam, we are thinking, okay, history has to follow this trajectory. First comes the Renaissance, then comes the Enlightenment, then comes industrialization, then comes modernity. This is how it happened in Europe. So let's search for all of these in Kerala, right? Or in Bengal or whatever it is. And it is where history becomes a matter of mere repetition. There is no originality in our history, right? We're just repeating what happened elsewhere, and that's how we proceed. That's how we get ahead. So Sumit Sarkar and others, V.C. Joshi, way back in the 1970s, had a very strong critique of the myth of the Bengal Renaissance. This is something that we study in school and at university, where they engaged with the idea of the Bengal Renaissance largely to argue that, look, how can we think about a Renaissance when we have a very compromised, colonized bourgeoisie, which is incapable of independent thought and action, that it functions within the structures, institutions, Hello? Can you hear me now? Sansar Chota. Hello?
Masha Kana.
Okay, great. So I'll start again. I'm sorry I got cut off in the middle. So to take up another example, that of B.R.
Okay, Masha
Ambedkar.
Kana.
Yes?
Ido fit hai.
Can I speak now?
Yeah, you can speak, Masha.
Okay. So B.R. Ambedkar, in his early essay on caste in 1916, which was written while he was a student at Columbia, he kind of is extremely critical of the idea of social reform in the 19th century. This is again something that we've studied at school and then we study in university, the idea that the 19th century was characterized by social reform and the inauguration of a certain kind of modernity, the question of widow remarriage, the question of ban on child marriage, etc., etc. And this idea that somehow India was becoming more modern before the question of nationalism arises. But as Ambedkar puts it very crisply in his essay, he says what we see here, whether we think about issues of widow remarriage or the ban on child marriage, is the reform of the upper caste Hindu family. Because these questions of widow remarriage never really occurred among the lower castes, among the backward castes. There was questions of child marriage, and their resolution really came up with regard to the Bengali and Maharashtrian Brahmin class, and so on and so forth. So his critiques of nationalism, Ambedkar's critiques of nationalism as bringing modernity into existence in India are very sharp, where he argues that regardless of the progress of nationalism, regardless of this movement to modernity, the untouchables are a part apart, right? They are a part, that means a section that is apart from the rest of society, forever condemned to live at the margins. So what does it mean to think about nationalism and modernity when large sections of the population live in another temporality, another time, another space even, and that continues into the present? So the second question that arises from this, which Ambedkar raises, is also, can there be a sociology of India when there is no conception of society in India, right? Our idea of society is that of exclusion, of hierarchy, right? It's of separation rather than of unity and interdependence. So he asks, can there be a sociology of India when we have no fraternity? We have liberty, perhaps, in the constitution. We have equality written into the constitution, but there is no fraternity, right? The Maitri Bhav, as he puts it. So it's just an ascending hierarchy of reverence and a descending hierarchy of contempt. No better characterization of Indian society can be made. This is something that continues into the present. So given all of these questions, why is it that our social sciences refuse to think with these immediate facts? That we are governed by questions and theoretical paradigms that come from elsewhere, from other societies, where we fail to create a theoretical understanding that brings together aesthetics and politics, that brings together literary criticism and an engagement with the fraught hierarchical landscape that we live in. And modernism, as embodied in Indian nationalism, was in many senses derivative, right? It was an attempt to be like Europe. That was the function of nationalism, despite the criticisms that Partha Chatterjee has of the idea of a derivative nationalism. Nationalism in India was governed by the desire for a state, for an abstract citizenship meaning a citizenship that did not take into account the multiple divisions and fractions within society. The attempt to create an Indian citizen actually left out the fact that society as such, as I pointed out earlier, did not exist, right? We were a society governed by separation and hierarchy. So nationalism was not about freedom for everyone. It was about freedom from the British for largely the elite. So this question, this grand narrative of nationalism and the grand narrative of civilization as embodied in Nehru's discovery of India and an invented history of the nation, etc., this was the paradigm that we worked with. It did not take into account the central fact, and this is a question that we could ask in the present as well. Did the Dalit have a right to life in India? We can move to the present and ask, does the Dalit have a right to life in India? And increasingly, under the present Hindu dispensation, the increasing Dalitization of the Muslim in India, right? Who has the right to life in India? It's largely the upper caste Hindu. So given all of these questions, how do we begin to reckon with the fact of the questions of the modern, the questions of the postmodern, when we are dealing with issues which are really located in a temporality that is sitting beside this? It's a parallel temporality that we seem to inhabit, and certainly that the Dalit seems to inhabit. So this question of difference is very crucial. That the way in which modernity, modernism, postmodernism, call it what you will, is enacted in India is very different from the temporality that exists, or the time space that exists in Europe and America. And so when you think about the ways in which we think about, if you think about Malayalam literature, and you think about an earlier time of U.V. Vijayan, M.T. Vasudevan Nair, Mukundan, and so on, and you think about the present, and you think about K.R. Meera and Benjamin and Johnny Miranda and others, how are we to begin to study these literary effects, right? Rather than resorting to notions of magical realism, notions of postmodernism, and so on, how do we try and understand these literary artifacts from within the social and historical space that we occupy? And this question became very important for me when I started working in the British Library. And I discovered that even as from the 1930s onwards, there was the emergence of an idea of India, which stretching from Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Gujarat to the northeast, a very landed history was emerging. Because this was the history that was conceived of by the elites for India, a landed history in which they possessed a certain degree of control, which, and the overthrowing of colonialism meant a transference from a British elite to an Indian elite, the kind of critique that Frantz Fanon had of elites all over the world, whether it's in Africa or elsewhere. So when we think about this kind of question, in the British Library, I found manuscript, small pamphlets written by people who are untouchables and lower caste, who refused this terrestrial paradigm, who saw freedom as lying in the ocean, freedom as lying in travel. Nationalism meant very little because nationalism allowed them a place only at the bottom of the hierarchy, a continuance of a history that they had experienced over generations. So pamphlets called Basarapata, Pinangu Yatra, as these untouchables and lower castes made their way across the ocean to Southeast Asia, to West Asia, made their fortunes, came back, for them nationalism had very little appeal. The new nation had very little appeal. What appealed to them was this transnational space of freedom, right? And very often they were engaging with modes of being and modes of thinking that did not arise from the standard narratives of our nationalist leaders, who were very neatly inserted into European narratives of modernity and enlightenment and freedom and so on and so forth. One of the books that has been unjustly forgotten or very little read in India is this book by G. Aloysius called Nationalism Without a Nation, which was again published in the 1990s. And what he argues there is that while mainstream nationalism very rarely made a case for equality for everyone, mainstream nationalism made a case for the transfer of power, as it were, from the British to the Indian elite. It was the lower caste movements, Aloysius argues, people like Narayana Guru, Periyar, Ambedkar, and so on, who made arguments which were universal for rights for everyone, freedom for everyone, and questions of dignity for everyone. Right? So if you think about our constitution itself, the fact it is not without significance that it is B.R. Ambedkar who was the chairman of the Constituent Assembly, which is why freedom and equality are written into every page. One can imagine. I mean, this is it's a historical fact that we need to take very seriously. It's almost as if the American Constitution was written by an assembly which was chaired by a slave, right? So in India, when we had the constitution that was written, it reflected these various subaltern imaginations, which rejected the modernity that was offered by nationalism, which aligned itself with a European modernity. So throughout the history of India, there is this parallel narrative arguing that we have never been modern, right? And this is the question. So even before we come to questions of modernism, postmodernism, and so on, we have to ask this question, have we ever been modern? And this is the critique that's been provided to us by these subaltern thinkers ranging all the way from Phule and Ambedkar through to the present. So instead of hitchhiking on narratives that come from elsewhere and asking what time is it there, to go back to the image that I began with, what if we attend to the hierarchies of our lives? What if we attend to the knowledge that is subject to the amnesia that Ganesh Devi talked about? Why do we not turn to the literary and intellectual resources that exist in our multiple languages, in our very lives, where we can ask the question, where are we in these histories that we write about? So, what are our real questions? What should be our real questions? A long time ago, again, to go back to the 90s, which is a moment that got blunted, right? In the 90s was a moment when there was a significant discussion on questions of caste, questions of difference, questions of these parallel imaginations, and particularly arising from places like Hyderabad. And Susie Taru, who was then a professor there, wrote a very important essay called The Impossible Subject, which dealt with the issue of caste. And she took up the story by a Dalit Maharashtrian writer, Baburao Bagul. And it's a story of a Dalit boy whose mother is an agricultural laborer. And it begins with the boy going to school. And the first thing that they do at school is the Saraswati Vandana. And the boy feels a sense of disturbance because Saraswati is not a part of his religious imagination. His religious imagination rests in the folk deities and the village deities and so on. And this is the dilemma, right, where we are asked to enter a space. So if you could substitute the Dalit boy for the Indian academic in a largely Euro-American political economy of academia, just as much as there is the Saraswati Vandana that is required of the Dalit boy, what we are required to address when we do postmodernism, modernism, and so on, we are asked to do this Lyotard Vandana and the Foucault Vandana, Derrida Vandana, and there we are, the Dalits and the larger political economy of a Euro-American academe, and we are all right with this. The question is, why are we all right with this? Why do we lack the changutam to say, no, we have traditions of thinking that come from our spaces. We have hierarchies in our spaces which we need to contend and fight against. We need to think with the literary, intellectual, historical resources that we have. We cannot write our histories with histories that come from elsewhere. So to conclude, since I'm coming up to around 35 minutes, so I'll leave before you a set of questions. One, what should be our theoretical frames? Can we continue with business as usual, right? Our education is in many senses, we are like the proletariat of a European political economy. We train our students in studying Western contemporary philosophy, the latest in whatever happens, in order that they can go cross the oceans and go do PhDs elsewhere. So what should be our theoretical frames? Second, how can we draw upon traditions of thinking from our spaces which address the question of an unresolved fraternity? India is not a space governed by fraternity. It was true in Ambedkar's time. It is true in our present moment as well. Maitri Bhav, as Ambedkar put it. When we cannot imagine a space within which there is a society characterized by affinity, by Maitri, what should our theoretical enterprise be? Can we just leap away from what surrounds us to dealing with purely abstract questions? Are categories like modernism, postmodernism, and their clunky translations useful? So, for example, when you have an idea that comes to us from outside, then we immediately think about a hugely Sanskritized Malayalam word like Uttaradhunikata, which makes very little sense to the average person. And so, what does it mean to constantly translate Europe into our lives, into our languages, into our imaginations? This is a question that we need to ask ourselves. And when we think about the very idea of post-colonial theory, the question is, are we beyond colonialism as yet? Because in many senses, the battle that is going on is the battle for our minds, where one of the things that colonialism has done is precisely this amnesia that Ganesh Devi talked about, where we are willing to accept theoretical categories that come from elsewhere, and we do not have the courage or the temerity to forge concepts of our own. And Deleuze and Guattari, in their wonderful book, What is Philosophy, say philosophy is about generating concepts. Right? And that is something that we have not been able to do in many years of independence, so to speak, whatever that independence may mean. So creating a conceptual vocabulary from our thought and practice is the most important question before us. How do we change theory? And that's a question that I'd like to leave you with, instead of asking constantly, what time is it there? Like that young man languishing in a cinema hall, watching French films, setting his watches to French time, and so on. How do we live with this Indian time, or we live with the time of Kerala, live with the time of the subaltern? What would it mean for our larger theoretical enterprise? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Mashe.
പറയൂ.
Hello.
പറയൂ.
Mashe, am I audible there? Am I audible there?
എനിക്ക് കേൾക്കാം, പറഞ്ഞോളൂ. അല്ല, ഷാജി പറയുന്ന എല്ലാം കേൾക്കുന്നുണ്ട്.
ഓക്കെ മാഷെ, ഓക്കെ മാഷെ. അപ്പോ വളരെ നന്നായിരുന്നു മാഷെ. ഒരു ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ ഞാൻ ചോദിക്കട്ടെ?
ഓ, തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും. അതിനല്ലേ നിങ്ങൾ നിൽക്കുന്നത് അവിടെ. ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ ചോദിച്ചോളൂ.
ഒരു ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ ചോദിക്കട്ടെ?
ചോദിച്ചോളൂ.
മാഷെ, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Please go ahead.
മാഷെ, ഇപ്പൊ ഇന്ത്യൻ ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയോഗ്രഫിയുടെ ഈ മോഡേണിറ്റിയും പോസ്റ്റ് മോഡേണിറ്റിയും ക്ലബ് ചെയ്തുകൊണ്ട് സംസാരിച്ചപ്പോ എനിക്കറിയാൻ കൗതുകമുള്ള കാര്യം, യു ആർ ലിവിംഗ് ഇൻ സൗത്ത് ആഫ്രിക്ക നൗ ഫോർ സോ മെനി ഇയേഴ്സ്.
അതെ.
അപ്പൊ ഇന്ത്യൻ ഹിസ്റ്റോറിയോഗ്രഫിയെ കുറിച്ച് മാഷ് പറഞ്ഞ ഈ സംഗതികൾ ആഫ്രിക്കൻ ഹിസ്റ്ററിക്കും ബാധകമാണോ?
അതെ. Actually, whatever you say is true of the global south. That includes Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, which is why I work with the category of the global south, in which India or South Asia is but an example of the consequences of a certain form of violent coloniality, right? Where we have been unable to generate or think with our intellectual resources. And this is the problem that has been posed by Caribbean theorists like Sylvia Wynter, by Latin American theorists like Walter Mignolo, Enrique Dussel, and Maria Lugones. The question that has been raised by Chinese thinkers like Quan-Sin Chen and Wang Hui. So this is a problem that afflicts all of us in the global south. I don't think this is a problem that's particular to India or South Africa. So I speak from a position that we still have to reckon with these relations of coloniality and the question of the political economy of academia, where all we are condemned to do is to repeat what happens elsewhere. We all search for the newest element that is coming out of Europe, and we want to show ourselves proficient in it, rather than thinking, how do we produce a knowledge from our spaces? I hope that answers your question.
അംബേദ്കർ, ഫൂലെ ഒക്കെ വെച്ചിട്ട് ഇന്ത്യൻ കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റിൽ പറഞ്ഞു. കേരള മോഡേണിറ്റിയെ കുറിച്ച് ഇപ്പൊ മാഷ് പഠിക്കുന്നുണ്ടല്ലോ, കേസരി. അപ്പൊ കേരള റിനൈസൻസിലും കേരളത്തിന്റെ ഒരു മോഡേണിറ്റിയിലും ഇത് മാഷ് എങ്ങനെയാണ് ഇതിന്റെ ഒരു സാധ്യത കാണുന്നത്? മാഷ് ഇപ്പൊ പറഞ്ഞ ആ ഒരു കൊളോണിയാലിറ്റിയുടെ ഒരു സാധ്യത.
അല്ല, ഇപ്പൊ നമ്മൾ ഈ കാറ്റഗറീസ് ദാറ്റ് വി യൂസ്, ഇപ്പൊ റെനസോൺസ് പറയുന്നതിന് എന്തുകൊണ്ട് നമ്മൾ ഒരു Renaissance പോലെ ഒരു കാറ്റഗറി നമ്മൾ ഉപയോഗിക്കുന്നു? That's the question that I'm asking. These categories which reflect a certain historical trajectory in Europe, that in Europe went through the Dark Ages, it went through a Renaissance, then it went through an Enlightenment and scientific revolution, then we had the emergence of capitalism, then we had the emergence of modernity. That is the whole sequence. And then we ask ourselves, we must look for these same things in our history. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, even in Kerala, our historians have been trapped in this, where we look for the Navotthana. Bengal, the historians of Bengal have actually created these critiques of the very idea of Renaissance for Bengal, saying that when we think about colonialism, what we have is a very colonial modernity within which the possibility of a renaissance, an independent bourgeoisie that is able to recover its own traditions of thinking, that has become impossible, right? And if you think about people like Kuttikrishna Maharar, this is the enterprise that they're engaged in. Why does Kuttikrishna Maharar go back to the Mahabharata, right? Why does he look for modes of thinking, modes of literary criticism that arise from his spaces? Take again somebody like Kesari Balakrishnavalla. One might argue, one kind of argument that you could make is that, look, he was a man of the world. He read everything. He read Proust, he read Italian literature, he read Scandinavian literature, and so on. But at each point, what he was doing with all of this was to enter into a comparative exercise, right? He was not saying we just need to read this and see what is lacking in our spaces. If you read his essays carefully, when he writes about Italian futurism, there is a critique. When he writes about Scandinavian literature and Ibsen, there is a critique, where he argues that this may not be suitable for the ways in which we need to understand our spaces. Right? So I think the important thing here is to, whether it's India at large, whether it's Kerala in particular, that we have had intellectuals who have tried to work with the wellsprings of thought and philosophy relating to questions of equality, freedom, dignity that arise from our spaces. So you think about all of Narayana Guru's thinking, for example, right? The very fact that Kerala is what it is right now, right, where we do have a certain degree of mutual respect and attempt at fraternity, does not come to us from Thomas Paine, does not come to us from Marx, does not come to us from James Mill. It comes to us from traditions of thinking that arise from our spaces and our attempts to create a larger humanity, right? So that's really the point that I'm trying to make.
Masha, my last question.
Yes.
Actually, when we talk about the seminar for the first time, I really wanted to talk. I told you talk about history and literature, but you tend to this subject. My last question is this: Masha, ധാരാളം നോവലുകൾ പഠിച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടല്ലോ. How do you think? How do you see and how to write ഈ നോവലും ഹിസ്റ്ററിയും തമ്മിലുള്ള റിലേഷനെ പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് കൊളോണിയൽ മോഡേണിറ്റിയുടെ കോണ്ടെക്സ്റ്റിൽ മാഷ് ഇന്റർപ്രറ്റ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ സരസ്വതി വിജയ ഉൾപ്പെടെ how relevant is it now?
Well, this question of colonial modernity, then I've talked about quite a bit. But when we study literature, which is why I've been talking about Kuttikrishna Maharar or I've been talking about Balakrishnavalla in the course of my response to your questions, we also have to think about the fact of the space of Malayalam literature. There is a way in which we tend to think about Malayalam, the space of Malayalam or Keralam, as extending from Kasaragod to Kanyakumari. We think with a very landed imagination. But if we think about our novels, right, you think about Vilasini's Avagashikal, which is actually set in Malaysia. Or you think about novels that K.R. Meera writes, which are set in Calcutta and places. Think about Benjamin's novels, which are set in the Gulf, right? So, or you think about Perumbadavam Sankirtanam Pole, which is actually a discussion of Russia, Dostoevsky, right? So what we have in Kerala is this large imagination which is constantly affected by the fact that Kerala is a part of a world at large. And what we have done as a result of a certain kind of egalitarian imagination is subordinated the world to our imagination, right? What makes it possible? In no other literature do you find this. Right? In no other literature in Kerala, in India do you find this, where Anand, for example, will write Govardhan Yatra, which is actually taking from Dharmir Bharati's, he writes a novel that is about the UP landscape. Meera writes about Bengal. Radhakrishnan writes about Bengal, and so on and so forth, where we have taken the world and made it our own. What has made that possible? That is a question that is before us. And I think to kind of subordinate Malayalam literature to a paradigm that looks at merely modernism, postmodernism, and so on does not help us really. We have to think about the internal transformations that have happened, which go back to these movements of egalitarianism. So we can't think our literature separately from our history. We can't think about our literature and history only through the production of our elites. We have to take into account those hundreds and thousands of Pulayas and Cheramas who went to Penang and Basra and others and brought back an imagination of freedom from across the ocean, which inflected our imagination. So I think it requires of us to have a vast imagination where we have to think about the world. We also have to think about our traditions of intellectualism, which allow us to see the world differently. Malayalam literature is distinct. A Malayali has the changutam to write about Bengal or about Malaysia or about the Gulf. Right? Most regional language literatures are regional language literatures. Bengalis writing about Bengal, Maharashtrians writing about Maharashtra. What has made this possible? That is the question we need to answer. And I think that arises from what I've been trying to argue, that what the impulse for equality, the struggles for equality in Kerala have done is it has made clear an idea that all knowledge is available to everybody, right? And this is an important principle, right? That all knowledge is available to everybody, which is why you find that Johnny Miranda is as much a star on our literary firmament as K.R. Meera or anybody else, right? We have a space of the literary imagination that is not governed by hierarchy largely. It has the world as its oyster, as the English phrase goes. So I think the important thing when I'm talking about history is that I'm also talking about literature. And when I'm talking about literature, I have to talk about history as well.
Thank you very much, Masha, for joining us and deliver a wonderful talk.
No, thank you, Shali. Thank you for having me. I'm sorry I could not be there in person, but
yeah.
Okay, bye-bye. I'm going to disconnect now.
No. Yeah, you can.
Okay.
Thank you, man.